Tucked away in the heart of Berlin, just a 15-minute walk from the Berliner Dome, and Museum Island, lies a forgotten cemetery that spans the history of the Kingdom of Prussia. This is the old garrison cemetery, once the final resting place for Prussian officers, statesmen, and civilians. It's a hidden gem and it's usually overshadowed, but it's something that I think is worth visiting. Permanent military garrisons began forming inside of Berlin following the 30 Years' War. And in 1701, when Berlin became the capital of a newly formed Kingdom of Prussia, the military presence inside of the city had expanded quite considerably. So much so that the garrison church, a Protestant church for the soldiers, was founded. It was located inside of the city's medieval fortifications, approximately where Hackescher-marked S-Bahn station is located today. Simultaneously, land located outside of the city walls was put aside for a cemetery for the officers and soldiers of the various units of the Berlin garrison. And although the remnants of this cemetery are known today as the Old Garrison Cemetery, they were once referred to as the New Cemeteries. Today, the Alte Garnisonfriedhof is a fraction of its former size. Originally, the cemetery consisted of two sections, one for officers and one for rank-and-file soldiers. Today's cemetery sits on roughly 70% of the original officer section. The section for the common soldiers was sold off and redeveloped in 1900. In the 18th century, the Berlin garrison's cemetery was used mostly by poorer families and low-level noble families. More prominent burials continue to occur in the church crypts and church graveyards. Some of the earliest notable graves are from the late Baroque and early neoclassical transition period, roughly 1780 to 1800, very much influenced by the Enlightenment. These are graves of men who served through the wars when Prussia established itself as a European power, most famously under the direction of Prussian King Frederick the Great. The oldest known grave is of Major Franz Heinrich von Barfus, who was laid to rest here in 1796. Barfus fought during the 7 Years' War. This means that the location of the graves from the first 93 years of the cemetery have been lost, though the remains are likely still buried under these grounds. Another early grave is that of Colonel Georg Friedrich Wilhelm von Winterfeld, who died in 1800. He and Barfus are the only two late 18th century officers whose grave markers are still standing in the cemetery today. As was the case at Invalidenfriedhof, which I recently published a video of, two events would lead to the elevation of this cemetery, particularly the officer section, which became notable for its artistic and historic value. The first was the Prussian land law of 1794, which banned burials in church crypts and graveyards in the city. The second reason was the burials of military figures involved in the wars of liberation against Napoleonic France. Arguably the most notable burial from the Napoleonic Wars is of Adolf von Lutzow, who was then just a major and led the Black Free Corps. These were guerrilla units made up of local citizens' militia from not just Prussia, but throughout much of today's Germany. They slipped behind French lines in small detachments, cutting communications, destroying supply depots, and ambushing patrols under cover of darkness. The name Black Free Corps derives from the reality that these irregular forces had to furnish their own weapons and uniforms. They dyed their clothing black because that was the only dye color that could conceal the original color of the fighters' clothes. And due to their multi-regional makeup, they helped seed the idea of a shared German identity long before political unification. And another notable burial from this period is that of General Karl Friedrich von den Knesebeck. He was a close advisor to King Friedrich Wilhelm III and a key strategist during the Napoleonic Wars, who helped plan the 1813 campaign against and the ultimate defeat of Napoleon. Despite not being as well known as Wellington or Prussia, Knesebeck played a crucial role in uniting European powers against France. And here we have the grave of General Karl Ludwig von Borstal. This is just a memorial marker added here by the city of Berlin because the general's original grave marker was lost to history. Two other prominent graves offer a fascinating side note on Prussian and Berlin history. Huguenot refugees who fled persecution in France in the late 17th century were invited to settle in Brandenburg, Prussia, including Berlin. Following the 30 Years' War, the kingdom was in desperate need of skilled workers in all areas of society. These refugees included noble French military men who were attracted by the commissions as officers in the Prussian king's military. At least two notable descendants of these Huguenot refugees can still be found in the Alte Garnisonfriedhof. The first is General Friedrich August Peter von Kolm, who was a captain and comrade-in-arms of Lutzow. He participated in the Napoleonic Wars of 1813-1814 and distinguished himself as a leader of the volunteer troops. He ultimately served as a general of the cavalry and from 1841, commandant of Berlin. And the other is Friedrich de la Motta Forqué, who is better known as an author and leader of the German Romanticism movement than he is as a military man. And from what I understand, his fairy tale, Undine, or Undine, which featured a water spirit heroine, later inspired Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. And throughout this and many cemeteries throughout Germany, you will find a relic from the fight against Napoleon's France. And in the Alte Garnisonfriedhof, you won't have to look far to find iron crosses on grave markers. During the Wars of Liberation, Prussian citizens were encouraged to trade their gold for iron to help finance the military campaigns. Iron became a badge of shared sacrifice and of patriotic virtue. So much so that in 1813, King Frederick Wilhelm III commissioned a new medal, not of gold or bronze, but of iron. This new Prussian military medal was designed by none other than Prussia's most renowned architect and designer, Carl Friedrich Schinkel, who based his design on the cross used by the Teutonic Knights as a standard. And naturally, many recipients of the Iron Cross proudly display it on their grave markers. Iron also became fashionable as grave markers, and the Prussian royal foundries, including the one here in Berlin, were among the first ironworks in Europe that could cast large, artistically finished iron objects at scale. Their catalogs soon listed funerary crosses and slabs alongside cannons and tea kettles. And you can see the fruits of their work here. There is a diversity of cast iron designs featuring, for the most part, crosses. But you will also find Gothic tablets, stelae, and tabernacles. And as is the case in Invalidenfriedhof, you will find a few examples of cast iron graves topped with Prussian officer helmets with their parade plumes. This one is for Karl von Schachtmeier, a Prussian officer, and it's also credited to Schinkel. And since this cemetery was connected to the garrison church, it's no surprise that you will find more overtly Christian grave markers. This particular grave marker belongs to Emil Frommel, who served as the garrison chaplain from 1869 onwards and from 1872 as a court chaplain in Berlin. Things would begin to change in the second half of the 19th century. The city had grown around the two cemeteries, and new cemeteries had been opened up outside of the city's boundaries. The general soldiers section was closed and turned into a park. And by the end of the century, it was turned over to redevelopment. Where it once stood is now a standard inner city block of mostly residential buildings. The officer section would remain open for burials until 1951. A walk around the cemetery will bring you to many graves for soldiers who served in World War I, with many having died from the conflict. It doesn't appear that the Nazis favored this cemetery for burials of Nazi officials, as they did with Invalidenfriedhof. During the 13-year reign of the Nazis, burials of Prussian officers continued. The officer cemetery was in the direct path of Red Army units as they reached the final city defenses during the Battle of Berlin. And although I found no major combat being recorded specifically in the cemetery, several of the gravestones seem to show clear evidence of fighting. And if you make your way to the cemetery's southeast corner, you will come across grave markers of approximately 1,300 war dead. These mass graves hold the remains of primarily citizens and civilians and German soldiers, many of whom likely lost their lives in the immediate vicinity. Among them is 19-year-old soldier Tony Feller, who died just as Soviet forces were overtaking Berlin. A closer look reveals that many of the deceased are listed as Unbekannte, unknown individuals, with one marker alone naming 161 unidentified victims. For those whose names are recorded, most died during the closing days of the Battle of Berlin. Perhaps even more striking, many of the inscriptions list only the month of death, an indication that the remains were recovered days or even weeks after the actual fighting. Similar mass graves can be found in cemeteries throughout Berlin, often containing unknown individuals or listing dates that coincide with the final battle or major air raids earlier in the week. The cemetery was eventually closed to new burials in 1951. It lay mostly neglected, its tombs and mausoleums allowed to decay. It would receive protected status in the 1970s. Roughly 300 of the original 489 graves of the officers' cemetery were removed. As was the case in Friedhof, special attention seems to have been paid to veterans of the Napoleonic Wars when Prussian and Russian militaries fought side by side. This was politically palatable in the GDR. Since reunification, the Berlin Senate, in conjunction with the Friends of the Old Berlin Garrison Cemetery, has maintained the cemetery and worked to raise awareness as well as funds. There is a map of the cemetery at the entrance, but it's in German, so bring Google Translate. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you might also enjoy this video that I made of the Invalidenfriedhof, or check out this video where I go over the top locations in Berlin where you can learn more about World War II. And I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!